It's 480 years before Christ, and the sun is just beginning to rise over a narrow mountain pass in central Greece. The air is thick with morning mist, but there's something else hanging in the atmosphere, tension so heavy you could cut it with a sword. This place has a name that sends shivers down your spine, Thermopylae, which literally means the hot gates, because of the natural hot springs that bubble up from the earth nearby. Standing in perfect formation across this narrow passage are 300 of the most feared warriors the ancient world has ever known. These aren't just any soldiers. These are Spartans, men who have been training for war since they were 7 years old. Their bronze armor gleams in the early light, and their long spears create a deadly forest of iron points facing north. Behind them, the fate of every free Greek city hangs in the balance. But here's what makes your blood run cold. Marching toward them is an army so massive that ancient historians claimed it took 7 days and 7 nights just to cross a single bridge. The Persian Empire, led by their god King Xerxes, has mobilized what might be the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. Some say it numbered in the millions. Others claim hundreds of thousands. But everyone agrees on one thing. It was absolutely enormous. Now you might be wondering, how did it come to this? How did 300 men end up standing against what seemed like the entire world? The answer lies in a story of pride, prophecy, and an impossible choice that would echo through history for over 2,000 years. King Leonidas of Sparta wasn't just any ruler. He was a man forged in the brutal Spartan training system called the agoge, where boys learned that death in battle was preferable to retreat. But even more than that, he was a man who had received a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi that chilled him to the bone. Either Sparta would fall, or a Spartan king would die. There was no third option. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. Here was Xerxes, who controlled an empire stretching from India to Egypt, commanding resources that dwarfed anything the Greeks could imagine. He had war elephants, elite guards called the immortals, and enough ships to darken the sea. Yet he found himself staring across a gap no wider than a modern football field at a handful of Greeks who simply refused to bow. What makes this moment even more incredible is that Leonidas had a choice. He could have pulled back, regrouped with the main Greek army, and fought another day. Many of his allies had already begun to retreat when they saw the true size of the Persian force. But Leonidas made a decision that would transform him from a king into a legend. He would stay, fight, and die if necessary to buy Greece the time it needed. The beauty of Thermopylae wasn't just in its narrow width, it was in its perfect design for defense. The pass was squeezed between the sea on one side and steep cliffs on the other. No matter how many soldiers Xerxes brought, he could only attack with a few men at a time. It was like trying to pour the ocean through a straw. The Spartans had turned geography itself into their ally. As the first rays of sunlight burned away the morning mist, both armies could see each other clearly for the first time. The Persians stretched back beyond the horizon, their colorful banners and exotic armor creating a rainbow of conquest. The Greeks, in their simple bronze and red cloaks, looked almost plain by comparison. But there was something in their stance, something in the way they held their spears, that suggested this wouldn't be the easy victory Xerxes had expected. What happened next would become the stuff of legends. For 3 days, the hot gates would become exactly that. A gateway to hell where heroes were born and empires learned that sometimes the smallest key can lock the mightiest door. The echoes of bronze on bronze, the clash of spear on shield, and the defiant war cries of free men would ring out across the centuries, inspiring everyone from Roman generals to modern freedom fighters. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the end, but with the moment when 300 men looked at impossible odds and said those immortal words that still give us chills today. Come and take them. Before we unravel this tale of sacrifice, steel, and strategy, smash that like button, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and ring the bell. The past is waiting. To understand why this moment was so earth-shattering, we need to step back and see the bigger picture. Imagine you're looking at a map of the ancient world in 480 before Christ. The Persian Empire is like a massive ink stain that has spread across almost everything you can see. From the golden palaces of Babylon to the pyramids of Egypt, from the silk roads of Central Asia to the cedar forests of Lebanon, one man rules it all, Xerxes, who his subjects literally worship as a god walking among mortals. But here's the thing about Xerxes. He's carrying a wound that won't heal. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had sent a massive invasion force across the Aegean Sea to punish the Greeks for supporting rebellions in Persian territory. Everyone expected it to be a quick victory. After all, what could a few scattered Greek cities do against the might of an empire that had conquered everything from India to Libya? Then came Marathon. On a plain not far from Athens, something impossible happened. The Persian army, led by generals who had never known defeat, was not just beaten. They were completely routed by a much smaller force of Athenian citizen soldiers. The Persians fled back to their ships so fast that the Greeks couldn't even catch them all. It was like watching a giant stumble and fall because he stepped on a pebble. For Darius, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a personal humiliation that haunted him until his death. And now his son Xerxes sits on the throne, hearing whispers in the palace corridors about how the mighty Persians ran from a bunch of Greek farmers. Every day that passes without revenge is another day that the empire looks weak, another day that other conquered peoples might start getting ideas about rebellion. So Xerxes makes a decision that will change the course of history. He's not going to send just another army. He's going to lead the largest invasion force the world has ever seen. For 3 years, he mobilizes resources from every corner of his empire. Ships are built by the thousands, roads are carved through mountains, and bridges are constructed across rivers. The logistics alone are mind-boggling. Ancient historians tell us that his army consumed so much food and water that they literally drank rivers dry and stripped entire regions bare. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Greece isn't even a country in the way we think of it today. It's more like a collection of independent city-states that spend almost as much time fighting each other as they do fighting foreign enemies. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful cities, have been rivals for generations. It's like asking New York and Boston to suddenly become best friends because aliens are invading. Athens has built its power on trade and its incredible navy. Their ships, called triremes, are like floating battering rams with bronze-plated prows designed to punch holes in enemy vessels. But on land, Athenian soldiers are good, not great. They're citizen soldiers who train part-time and fight when they need to defend their city. Sparta, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. They barely have a navy worth mentioning, but their army is absolutely terrifying. Every Spartan male is essentially a professional soldier from childhood. They don't just train for war, they live for it. Other Greeks tell stories about Spartan mothers who would rather see their sons die in battle than come home as cowards. The tragedy is that these two cities, along with dozens of others, have been so busy competing with each other that they've almost forgotten about the massive threat building in the east. It's like watching neighbors argue over a fence while a forest fire races toward their neighborhood. Then the Persian messengers arrive. They come to every major Greek city with the same demand, earth and water. It sounds simple, but everyone knows what it means. Earth and water are the ancient symbols of submission. Give them to Xerxes, and you're saying that your land and your people now belong to the Persian Empire. Refuse, and you're declaring war against the most powerful military force in the world. Some cities cave immediately. Who can blame them? The smart money says that resistance is suicide. Others try to play both sides, hoping to wait and see which way the wind blows. But Athens and Sparta do something that surprises everyone, including themselves. They unite. Not because they suddenly love each other, but because they realize that if they don't stand together, they'll definitely fall separately. The Athenians throw the Persian messengers into a pit. The Spartans go even further. They toss them down a well, supposedly shouting, "If you want earth and water, dig for it down there." It's the ancient equivalent of hanging up on a telemarketer, except the telemarketer commands millions of soldiers. Now both cities have crossed a line they can't uncross. Xerxes isn't just angry, he's furious. He's spent 3 years preparing for this moment, and the Greeks have essentially spat in his face. There's no negotiation possible anymore, no diplomatic solution. It's going to be total war, and everyone knows it. As spring arrives in 480 before Christ, the reports start filtering in. Persian scouts have been seen in northern Greece. Local farmers talk about dust clouds on the horizon that stretch for miles. Fishing boats return to port with stories of a Persian fleet so large it looks like a floating city. The storm that Xerxes has been brewing for 3 years is finally about to break over Greece. The Greeks know they're outnumbered, probably by 10 to 1, maybe more. They know they're facing an enemy with better equipment, more experience, and resources that seem unlimited. But they also know something else. They're fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. And sometimes, when everything seems hopeless, that's when ordinary people do extraordinary things. At the heart of this impossible situation stand 2 men who couldn't be more different, yet both shaped by the weight of empires on their shoulders. Let's start with Leonidas, because his story reads like something out of a legend, except it's all true. Picture a 7-year-old boy being torn from his mother's arms and marched off to a military camp where he'll spend the next 13 years. That's how every Spartan male's life begins, in a system so harsh that the Greeks themselves called it the agog, which basically means the leading or the guidance. But this wasn't guidance in the way we think of it today. This was a brutal forge designed to hammer boys into weapons. Leonidas survived sleeping on beds of reeds, eating just enough black broth to stay alive, and fighting other boys with his bare hands. He learned to steal food not because stealing was encouraged, but because getting caught meant punishment. The lesson was clear. Be clever, be tough, or be dead. By the time he was 20, he had become something that would terrify enemies and inspire allies for centuries to come, a perfect Spartan warrior. But here's what makes Leonidas even more remarkable. He wasn't supposed to be king. Sparta had a unique system where they actually had 2 kings at the same time, from 2 different royal families. Leonidas was the second son, which meant he was supposed to live and die as a warrior, not a ruler. It was only when his older brother died without a male heir that the crown fell to him. So this man who would make one of history's greatest last stands was literally born to be a backup plan. When Leonidas finally became king, he was already in his 50s, an old man by ancient standards. His face was lined with scars from countless battles, his hands permanently shaped by decades of gripping spear and shield. But his eyes, those who met him said, burned with an intensity that could make even veteran warriors look away. This wasn't just a king who happened to be a soldier. This was a soldier who happened to wear a crown. Now imagine the complete opposite of this battle-scarred Spartan warrior, and you'll start to understand Xerxes. Where Leonidas had earned his throne through survival and sacrifice, Xerxes had inherited the greatest empire the world had ever seen. He ruled from palaces so magnificent that visitors would literally fall to their knees in awe. His court was filled with gold, silk, and treasures from every corner of the known world. But here's the fascinating thing about Xerxes. He wasn't just some spoiled prince playing at war. He was actually a capable ruler who had spent years learning statecraft and military strategy. The problem was that he lived in a world where everyone told him he was a god. When you're surrounded by people who worship you as divine, it becomes pretty easy to believe that you're invincible. And that belief was about to collide with reality in the most spectacular way possible. The contrast between these 2 men becomes crystal clear when we look at how they each handled the moment that would define their legacies. When Xerxes' messengers came to Sparta demanding earth and water, they probably expected the same response they'd gotten from other cities: fear, negotiation, maybe even immediate submission. After all, they represented the largest military force in human history. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Leonidas didn't need to consult advisors or call a council meeting. He didn't need time to think it over. His response was immediate and came from somewhere so deep in his warrior's soul that it would echo through history. molon labe, come and take them. Those three words in ancient Greek captured everything that made Sparta what it was. It wasn't just defiance. It was a challenge. Leonidas wasn't just refusing to submit. He was daring the Persian Empire to try and make him. It was like a man with a knife challenging someone with a machine gun to a duel, except the man with the knife had spent his entire life learning how to use it. But there's something else about Leonidas that makes his story even more tragic and heroic. Before he ever set foot in the hot gates, he had visited the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred shrine in Greece. The oracle was a priestess who supposedly spoke for the god Apollo, and her prophecies were taken as absolute truth. What she told Leonidas would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. The prophecy was simple and terrible. Either Sparta would fall to the Persians, or a Spartan king would die. There was no third option, no clever way around it. Leonidas could save his city, but only by sacrificing his life. For most men, this would be an impossible choice. For a Spartan king who had been trained since childhood to value honor above life, it wasn't really a choice at all. Think about what that means for a moment. Leonidas knew with absolute certainty that marching to Thermopylae was marching to his death. He had a wife he loved, a son who would inherit his throne, and a city that needed him. But he also had a duty that transcended all of these personal desires. He was going to die so that Sparta could live. Meanwhile, Xerxes was making preparations that reflected his completely different view of the world. He had his engineers build a throne on a hilltop overlooking the battlefield so he could watch his victory in comfort. He brought his personal chefs, his wine tasters, and even his harem. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a royal expedition, a chance for the god-king to personally witness the destruction of those who had dared to insult him. The irony is almost too perfect. Here was Xerxes, commanding resources that could move mountains and change the course of rivers, yet he couldn't understand the one thing that would ultimately defeat him, the willingness of free men to die for their freedom. And here was Leonidas, knowing he was doomed, yet walking toward that doom with the calm confidence of a man who had found the one thing worth dying for. When these two men finally faced each other across the narrow pass of Thermopylae, it wasn't just a battle between armies. It was a collision between two completely different ways of seeing the world. The Persian belief that might makes right, and the Greek conviction that some things are worth more than life itself. One of them would win the battle, but both would lose something irreplaceable in the process. The first day of battle dawned with a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. The thunderous clash of bronze on bronze as the Persian army crashed against the Spartan shield wall like a wave hitting a cliff. Imagine the noise of 1,000 blacksmiths hammering at once, mixed with the screams of men and horses, and you might get close to what those first moments sounded like. Xerxes had started the morning feeling confident. He sent his best troops first, the Medes and the Scythians, warriors who had conquered nations for the Persian Empire. These weren't raw recruits. They were battle-tested veterans who had never known defeat. The plan was simple: overwhelm the Greeks with sheer numbers and superior weaponry. After all, what could a few hundred men do against thousands? But then something extraordinary happened. The narrow pass that had seemed like such a minor obstacle suddenly became the Greeks' greatest ally. No matter how many soldiers Xerxes sent forward, only a handful could actually fight at any given moment. It was like trying to pour the ocean through a funnel. The Persian advantage in numbers meant absolutely nothing when they could only attack 8 or 10 men at a time. The Spartans fought with a precision that was almost mechanical. Their shields locked together in what they called a phalanx, creating a wall of bronze that seemed impossible to break. Their spears, longer than the Persian weapons, kept the enemy at a distance while the Spartans themselves stayed protected behind their shields. It was a deadly dance they had practiced thousands of times, and it worked perfectly. Here's something that might surprise you. The Spartans weren't just standing there taking punishment. They were actually having fun. Ancient historians tell us that they joked and laughed between attacks, treating the whole thing like a particularly violent sporting event. When one Persian archer boasted that their arrows would be so numerous they would blot out the sun, a Spartan warrior supposedly replied, "Good, Then we'll fight in the shade." By the end of the first day, the ground in front of the Greek position was carpeted with Persian dead. Xerxes had thrown wave after wave of his best troops at the pass, and all he had to show for it was a pile of bodies and a bunch of Greeks who didn't seem even slightly tired. The God King was starting to realize that this wasn't going to be the easy victory he had expected. The second day brought even more desperate attacks. Xerxes sent in his elite guard, the famous immortals, 10,000 warriors who were supposedly the best fighters in the world. They were called immortals because whenever one died, he was immediately replaced, so their numbers never seemed to decrease. These men had conquered everything from Egypt to India, and they had never met an enemy they couldn't defeat. The immortals charged with absolute confidence, expecting to sweep the Greeks aside like leaves in a windstorm. Instead, they ran headfirst into the same deadly meat grinder that had chewed up everyone else. The Spartan spears found the gaps in their armor, the Greek shields turned aside their attacks, and by the end of the day, the immortals looked anything but immortal. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. As the sun was setting on the second day, a local shepherd named Ephialtes approached the Persian camp. This man knew the mountains around Thermopylae like the back of his hand, and he had information that would change everything. For a bag of gold, he was willing to show the Persians a hidden path that would let them sneak around behind the Greek position. The path was called the Thermopylae, and it was little more than a goat track that wound through the mountains. Most armies would never have been able to use it, but Xerxes had brought troops from every corner of his empire, including mountain fighters who could navigate terrain that would stop regular soldiers. That night, while the Greeks slept, thousands of Persian soldiers began the long, dangerous climb through the darkness. When dawn broke on the third day, everything had changed. A Greek scout came running down from the hills with news that made everyone's blood run cold. The Persians had found a way around. The trap that had worked so perfectly for 2 days was about to become a death trap for the Greeks themselves. Now Leonidas faced the most terrible decision of his life. He could order a full retreat, try to get his men back to safety, and live to fight another day. Most of his allies were already packing up to leave, and no one would have blamed him for doing the same. After all, they had already accomplished something incredible. They had held off the largest army in the world for 2 whole days. But Leonidas remembered the oracle's prophecy. He thought about his duty to Sparta, his oath to defend Greece, and the promise he had made to buy time for the rest of the Greek cities to prepare their defenses. Most of all, he thought about what it meant to be a Spartan. His people had a saying, "Come back with your shield or on it." There was no option for retreat, no possibility of surrender. So he made a choice that would echo through the ages. He ordered most of the Greek forces to retreat and save themselves. But he and his 300 Spartans would stay. They wouldn't be alone, though. 700 brave men from the city of Thespeae chose to stay with them, along with 400 Thebans. Over 1,000 Greeks, knowing they were about to die, decided that some things were worth more than life itself. The final battle wasn't really a battle at all. It was a massacre. The Greeks were surrounded, outnumbered by maybe 50 to 1, and they had nowhere to run. But they fought with a fury that amazed even their enemies. Ancient sources tell us that the Persians were so impressed by Greek courage that they later erected a monument to honor their fallen foes. Leonidas fell early in the fighting, struck down by arrows while trying to reach Xerxes himself. But even in death, he continued to inspire his men. The Spartans formed a circle around their king's body and fought until the very last man was dead. When it was over, Xerxes found himself staring at a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 1,000 men who had chosen death over dishonor. The Persian king had won the battle, but something had changed inside him. He had expected to crush the Greeks like insects, to barely even notice their resistance. Instead, he had discovered that there were people in the world who valued freedom more than life itself, and that discovery would follow him all the way to his final defeat. What would you have done in Leonidas's place? Let us know below. And don't forget to like and share this video. The more subscribers we have, the more battles we can bring to life. Standing among the bodies of 1,000 Greek warriors, Xerxes should have felt triumphant. He had finally broken through the pass that had defied him for 3 days. The road to Athens lay open before him, and his massive army was ready to continue its march of conquest. But instead of celebration, there was something hollow about his victory, something that left a bitter taste in his mouth. The cost had been staggering. Ancient historians disagree on the exact numbers, but most agree that Xerxes lost somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 men in those 3 days of fighting. That's more soldiers than many entire armies of the time. For 3 days of battle against a force that numbered barely over 1,000, it was a price that made even the Persian king pause and wonder if this conquest was worth it. But the real damage wasn't measured in bodies, it was measured in time. Those 3 precious days that Leonidas and his men had bought with their lives turned out to be worth more than all the gold in the Persian treasury. While Xerxes was hammering himself bloody against the hot gates, something extraordinary was happening throughout the rest of Greece. The news of the Spartan stand spread like wildfire. Runners carried the story from city to city, and with each telling, the tale grew more inspiring. Here was proof that the mighty Persian Empire could be stopped, that their god-king could bleed, that free men fighting for their homes could stand against impossible odds. Cities that had been wavering about whether to resist or submit suddenly found their courage. More importantly, those 3 days gave the Athenians the time they desperately needed to execute one of the most heartbreaking but brilliant strategic moves in military history. They made the agonizing decision to abandon their city entirely. Picture entire families loading everything they could carry onto ships, saying goodbye to homes their ancestors had lived in for generations, all because they understood that sometimes you have to lose everything to save everything. The Athenian leader Themistocles had been planning this for months, but he needed time to convince his people and coordinate the massive evacuation. Leonidas had given him that time. As the Persian army finally marched into Athens, they found a ghost town. The great enemy they had come to destroy had simply vanished like smoke. Xerxes was furious. He had expected to find a rich city full of treasures and cowering citizens ready to worship him as their new god. Instead, he found empty streets and abandoned buildings. In his rage, he ordered Athens burned to the ground. The flames could be seen for miles, and the smoke hung over the region like a dark cloud. But even as the city burned, Xerxes was beginning to realize that he had won a hollow victory. The real war was far from over. The Athenians hadn't disappeared. They had relocated to the nearby island of Salamis, where their powerful navy was waiting. And here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. The very qualities that had made Xerxes so successful on land were about to become his greatest weakness at sea. The Persian fleet was massive, probably numbering over 1,000 ships. But size isn't everything in naval warfare. The narrow waters around Salamis were nothing like the open seas where the Persian ships had operated before. Just like at Thermopylae, geography was about to become the Greeks' greatest ally. Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian admiral, had been studying Persian tactics for months. He knew that their ships were built for intimidation and overwhelming force, not for the kind of close-quarters fighting that would be necessary in the narrow straits. So he devised a plan that was both simple and audacious. He would trick the Persians into attacking him exactly where he wanted them to. The Battle of Salamis was like Thermopylae in reverse. Instead of a narrow land passage, it was a narrow water passage. Instead of the Persians having the advantage of numbers, their numbers became a disadvantage as their ships crashed into each other in the confined space. The smaller, more maneuverable Greek ships darted between the Persian vessels like wolves attacking a herd of cattle. Xerxes had built himself another throne, this time on a hill overlooking the bay, so he could watch his navy destroy the last major Greek resistance. Instead, he found himself watching his fleet being systematically destroyed. Ship after ship went down, taking with them not just Persian sailors but also the dreams of easy conquest that had driven this entire invasion. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical losses. For months, The Persian army had been told that they were invincible, that their god-king could not be defeated. Now they had watched their navy, the very force that had made this invasion possible, burning in the waters of Salamis. The myth of Persian invincibility was shattered as completely as their ships. But Xerxes wasn't finished yet. He still had the largest army in the world, and he was determined to salvage something from this disaster. The problem was that his army was running out of food. Remember, this force was so large that it had been stripping the countryside bare everywhere it went. With his navy destroyed, he couldn't get supplies from the sea, and the Greek scorched earth tactics meant there was very little food to be found on land. So Xerxes made a decision that would seal his fate. He would return to Persia with most of his army, but he would leave behind a force of about 300,000 men under his general Mardonius. This army would winter in northern Greece and then finish the conquest the following spring. It seemed like a reasonable plan, but it ignored one crucial factor. The Greeks had learned something important about themselves at Thermopylae. The following year, at a place called Plataea, the largest land battle in Greek history took place. This time, instead of a few hundred Spartans, there were thousands of Greek warriors from dozens of different cities. They had learned to fight together, to trust each other, and most importantly, they had learned that the Persians could be beaten. The Battle of Plataea was a complete disaster for the Persians. Mardonius was killed, his army was destroyed, and the survivors fled back to Asia as fast as they could run. The great invasion that had begun with such confidence and overwhelming force ended with the Persian Empire in full retreat. But here's the most remarkable thing about this entire story. None of it would have happened without those 3 days at Thermopylae. The time that Leonidas and his men bought with their lives had allowed the Greeks to evacuate Athens, prepare their navy, and most importantly, find their courage. Their sacrifice had shown the rest of Greece that resistance was possible, that the Persian Empire could be defeated, and that freedom was worth fighting for. Xerxes returned to his golden palaces, but he was never the same man who had left them. He had learned that there were forces in the world that couldn't be conquered with gold or intimidated with numbers. He had discovered that free men fighting for their homes were capable of things that slaves fighting for their masters could never achieve. And he had paid the ultimate price for that education: the loss of his aura of invincibility and the beginning of the end for Persian expansion into Europe. Years after the last Persian soldier had fled from Greek soil, something remarkable happened at Thermopylae. The Greeks returned to that narrow pass where so much blood had been spilled, and they did something that would ensure the story would never be forgotten. They carved words into stone. Not just any words, but perhaps the most perfect military epitaph ever written. The inscription was simple, elegant, and devastating in its understated power. "Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Just 22 words in ancient Greek, but they contained everything you needed to know about what had happened in that place. These men hadn't died as rebels or rogues. They had died doing exactly what their society had trained them to do, following the code that had shaped them since childhood. But here's what makes this even more powerful. These weren't actually Leonidas's last words. Ancient historians aren't even sure what his final words were, since he died in the chaos of battle surrounded by enemies. The inscription was created later, probably by the poet Simonides, as a way to capture the spirit of what the Spartan king and his men had represented. Sometimes the most important truths aren't found in exact historical records. They're found in the stories we tell ourselves about who we want to be. The genius of those words is that they don't boast about victory or claim divine favor. They don't even mention the enemy they were fighting. Instead, they focus on something much more profound: duty. These men had died not because they were forced to, but because they chose to honor the principles their society had taught them. In a world where most people followed orders out of fear, the Spartans had followed theirs out of love. Love for their city, their people, and their way of life. And that message resonated far beyond the borders of ancient Greece. As the centuries passed, the story of Thermopylae spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman generals told it to their troops before battle. Christian martyrs drew inspiration from it when facing persecution. Medieval knights saw it as the perfect example of chivalric sacrifice. The story had become bigger than the historical facts. It had become a symbol of something universal in the human experience. The phrase molon lab, those defiant words that Leonidas had supposedly spoken to the Persian messengers, took on a life of its own. In ancient Greek, it literally means, having come, take. But the spirit of it translates to something much more powerful. Come and take them. It became a rallying cry for anyone facing impossible odds, a way of saying that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. What's fascinating is how this ancient battle cry has echoed through history in the most unexpected places. When the Texans were surrounded at the Alamo in 1836, they were essentially facing the same choice that Leonidas had faced: retreat and live, or stay and die for something greater than themselves. The parallel wasn't lost on them. They knew they were writing their own version of the Thermopylae story. During the Second World War, Greek resistance fighters would scrawl molon labe on walls as a message to the occupying forces. It was a way of saying that even though their country had been conquered, their spirit remained unbroken. The Nazi war machine might have been more powerful than the Persian Empire, but the principle remained the same. Some things cannot be taken by force. They can only be surrendered. Even today, over 2,000 years later, you can find those words carved into military monuments, printed on flags, and tattooed on the arms of soldiers around the world. They've become a kind of universal code for the warrior spirit, a way of expressing the idea that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right despite your fear. But the legacy of Thermopylae goes deeper than just military inspiration. The story helped shape how Western civilization thinks about the relationship between the individual and the state, between duty and personal desire, between the few and the many. It asked questions that we're still grappling with today. What do we owe to our communities? When is it right to fight even when victory is impossible? How do we find meaning in sacrifice? The Greeks themselves understood that they had witnessed something special. Over the following centuries, Thermopylae became a kind of pilgrimage site. Visitors would come to see the place where the 300 had made their stand, to touch the stone monument and try to understand what had driven those men to choose death over dishonor. The battlefield became a classroom where each generation could learn about courage, duty, and the price of freedom. Perhaps most remarkably, the story even influenced how the Greeks saw themselves. Before Thermopylae, Greece was just a collection of rival city-states that spent most of their time fighting each other. But the shared experience of facing the Persian threat and the inspiration they drew from the Spartan sacrifice helped create something new, a sense of Greek identity that transcended local loyalties. In a very real sense, the idea of Greek civilization was born in that narrow pass. The irony is that Leonidas and his men probably never imagined their story would outlive them by millennia. They were just doing what they thought was right in the moment, following the code they had been taught since childhood. They couldn't have known that their last stand would become the gold standard for heroic sacrifice, that their names would be remembered long after the Persian Empire had crumbled to dust. And that might be the most important lesson of all. True heroism isn't about seeking glory or trying to make history. It's about doing what's right when it matters most, even when nobody is watching, even when the cost is everything you have. The men who died at Thermopylae achieved immortality, not because they were trying to be heroes, but because they were trying to be good Spartans, good Greeks, and good men. Their legacy lives on every time someone stands up to a bully, every time a soldier volunteers for a dangerous mission, every time someone chooses duty over comfort. It echoes in every memorial to the fallen, every monument to sacrifice, every story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the situation demands it. The hot gates may be silent now, but the echo of those bronze shields and the memory of those determined faces continue to inspire us. Because in the end, Leonidas and his 300 proved something that tyrants throughout history have tried to disprove, that the human spirit, when fighting for something it truly believes in, is the most powerful force in the world, and that's a lesson that will never grow old. Picture this. You're standing in a narrow mountain pass in Greece, and the only sound you hear is the wind whistling through ancient stones. The hot gates are silent now, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of bronze shields clashing against Persian spears. This is Thermopylae today, a peaceful tourist destination where families take photos and historians give tours. But 25 centuries ago, this very ground was soaked with blood and witnessed one of history's most defining moments. The lesson that emerged from those 3 days in 480 before Christ still resonates today, and it's beautifully simple. Courage isn't about not being afraid. Think about it for a moment. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans weren't fearless robots marching into battle. They were human beings with wives, children, and dreams of going home. They felt the same knot in their stomachs that any of us would feel facing impossible odds. But here's what made them extraordinary. They chose to act anyway. When Leonidas looked at that endless sea of Persian warriors stretching beyond the horizon, he knew exactly what was going to happen. The oracle had already told him that either Sparta would fall or a king would die. He understood that this wasn't about military victory in the traditional sense. This was about something much deeper, something that would outlive any single battle or campaign. What's fascinating is how Leonidas proved that numbers alone don't decide fate. Xerxes had everything a conqueror could want: the largest army ever assembled, unlimited resources, and the backing of the most powerful empire on earth. He had engineers who could bridge seas and generals who had never known defeat. On paper, this shouldn't have even been a contest. 300 men against hundreds of thousands? It sounds like a mathematical impossibility. But mathematics doesn't account for the human spirit. It doesn't calculate the power of fighting for something you believe in. When those Spartan warriors locked their shields together and lowered their spears, they weren't just creating a wall of bronze and wood. They were creating something infinitely stronger, a symbol of defiance that would inspire people for thousands of years to come. The beauty of their sacrifice lies in what it accomplished beyond the immediate battle. Yes, they all died. Yes, Xerxes marched on and burned Athens. But in those 3 days, something had changed in the Greek soul. Word of the Spartan stand spread like wildfire across the Greek cities. Suddenly, this massive Persian army didn't seem quite so invincible. If 300 men could hold them off for 3 days, what could a united Greece accomplish? The ripple effects were immediate and profound. The Greek fleet, inspired by the sacrifice at Thermopylae, fought with renewed determination at Salamis. They didn't just win, they obliterated the Persian navy. A year later at Plataea, the Persian army met its final defeat on Greek soil. The empire that had seemed unstoppable was sent limping back to Asia, never to threaten Greece again. But the real magic of Thermopylae wasn't in its immediate military consequences. It was in how it captured the imagination of humanity. Throughout history, whenever people have faced overwhelming odds, they've remembered the hot gates. When the defenders of the Alamo faced Santa Anna's army, they carried the spirit of Leonidas with them. When the Warsaw Ghetto fighters stood against the Nazis, they drew strength from the same well of courage. The phrase, "Come and take them," has become a rallying cry that transcends cultures and centuries. It's been inscribed on monuments, tattooed on soldiers' arms, and shouted in legislative chambers. Why? Because it represents something fundamental about human dignity. The idea that some things are worth dying for, and that sometimes the best way to preserve freedom is to show you're willing to sacrifice everything for it. What's truly remarkable is how this ancient story continues to evolve and inspire new generations. Modern special forces units study the tactical brilliance of the Spartan defense. Philosophers debate the ethics of the last stand. Artists create new interpretations of the legend. Each generation finds something different in the story, but they all find something meaningful. The 300 Spartans who died at Thermopylae could never have imagined that their names would still be spoken with reverence 25 centuries later. They thought they were simply doing their duty as Spartan citizens. But in choosing to stand and fight when they could have retreated, they created something immortal. They proved that sometimes all it takes is a small group of people who refuse to kneel, who refuse to accept that might makes right, who refuse to let fear dictate their choices. So when you think about Thermopylae, don't just remember it as an ancient battle fought by people in strange armor with unfamiliar weapons. Remember it as a story about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Remember it as proof that courage is contagious, that sacrifice can inspire, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from the willingness to fight battles you know you can't win. The hot gates are silent now, but their echo will never fade. In every act of defiance against tyranny, in every moment when someone chooses principle over safety, in every decision to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult, the spirit of Leonidas and his 300 lives on. That's the real legacy of Thermopylae. Not just that brave men died, but that their deaths taught us how to live. If this story stirred your spirit, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more sagas of valor. The next battle awaits,